All right. Well, it looks like we have critical mass here. So I'm going to start and honor the people who came on time. Thank you for joining us. My name is Cleveland Justis. I'm the founder and CEO of the Potrero Group. We are a consulting and executive search firm that specializes in the social sector clients, a lot of land conservation, land preservation, and other organizations. It's wonderful to have you here and joining us today for the webinar. Again, please introduce yourself in the chat, your name, your organization, and any questions you have relative to today's topic. I am joined here by an incredible panel, and the whole goal of this is to have a conversation among long-term CEOs as well, and highly accomplished senior CEOs. So I've prompted them with some questions. I'm going to have them introduce themselves rather than doing that because that's always more interesting. But I'll just say that you're in for a real treat. Incredible people here. We're going to be going for an hour and 15 minutes. I'm going to prompt them for some questions. We'll spend first half an hour, 35 minutes, 40 minutes in those conversations. But we want to be responsible and responsive to the questions that you have. So please put them in there, and my colleagues from the Potrero Group will help moderate those, or I'll catch them in the chat. So I would love just to have our panelists introduce themselves. I know you've seen their bios, so I don't like reading those. I'm going to have them introduce themselves, and then I'm going to ask them a general question, and I'll get to a couple specifics. So Deb, you're on first.
Thanks, Cleve. It's an honor to be here, and was very happy to be asked to do this. Deb Yandala. I was with the Conservancy for Cuyahoga Valley National Park in Ohio for 32 years, much of that as its CEO. I retired last summer, and I'm currently working as a consultant, mostly with the National Park Foundation.
Terrific. Gordon, why don't you chime in, bring your voice in here?
Thanks, Cleve. Happy to be here with you and everyone. I'm Gordon Clark. I'm the president of POST, or the Peninsula Open Space Trust, which is a nearly 50-year-old organization based in Palo Alto, California, that protects lands in and around the Bay Area. I've been in my role as president of POST for just a year and a half, but have been on the staff at POST for over 19 years. So happy to be here with everyone and looking forward to the conversation.
Dear.
Hello and welcome, everyone. And before I share a little bit about myself, I do want to say, Cleve, you picked your words very carefully when you said these are long-term CEOs. I was like, oh, is he going to say old CEOs? Thank you for sparing me that terminology, which my boys remind me of all the time.
I understand.
So I'm Dieter Fenkart-Froeschl. I'm the president and CEO of the National Forest Foundation. A little bit about myself. Originally from Austria. I grew up in Brazil, Chile, and Austria before coming to the US. Started my career in the private sector and banking, and then for the last 25 years have been in the nonprofit world, really wanting to leave this world in a better place for my children and their peers and all of our kids. The National Forest Foundation is the official national partner of the United States Forest Service, and we were chartered by Congress in 1990. We are about $200 million in total revenue and support, with about 200 staff across 48 states. And our mission is to transform America's love of nature into action for our national forests. And we do that through three main pillars of impact. One is wildfire resilience, the second is land and watershed restoration, and the third is all about recreation for all.
Wow, that's well articulated, Dieter. Do you have that memorized? That's impressive.
Yeah.
One of the reasons for this particular topic is we're seeing a lot of transitions among our clients, both in boards and with executives. Many of the executives stayed on through the pandemic and through the early years of this administration and decided to transition now. And we're seeing a lot of it, both on boards and in the executive suite. And we're seeing some commonalities and some challenges in those roles, and they're often tied together, long-term board members and long-term CEOs. And I would say when we do transitions for long-term CEOs, about 50% of the time they go really well, and 50% of the times they're challenges that many of you know from reading the literature on founder dynamics. Same thing applies to boards, and it's hard to ask people to come and talk about dysfunctions on their board, so we didn't do that. We brought 3 senior level people and long tenured executive directors, I think I said that right, that could offer a perspective, not on their own organizations, but just a sort of, they have a broad, all 3 of them have a broad look at the field, often national, if not, regional, if not national, which is why I invited them. So, Dieter, I'm going to invite you this time just to chime in, for a minute or two, just talk about your experience with long-term board members. And, I know you, particularly when you were at National Park Foundation, you saw a lot of partners and others. Just love to hear your experience with this topic. And then, Gordon, I'm going to go to you and then to Deb.
Yeah, happy to jump in here. And one of the things that I'm somebody who isn't inclined to come into a new organization or into a new space and clean house. I know there's a certain philosophy around that, but that's not my style. It's very much about how do you listen and understand the context for why the organization is at the place it's at. But one of the lessons I've learned in working with long tenured board members is that those board members are rarely resistant to change because they oppose the mission. It's more often because they're protective of the mission and they've invested so much of their own time and energy and resources over the years. So I feel, when you think about long tenured board members, what worked best for me was framing the evolution of the organization as a way to grow the mission and impact, and making sure that you're not abandoning the sort of legacy of what it was, what existed, but instead saying we need to change because of everything that the organization has accomplished thus far. That aspect of, I think, coming in and taking time to understand where the organization is, how it got there, listening to long-term or long-tenured board members to better understand their perspective is something that is key to the success of any new leader. And I'll say early in my career, I think, Cleve, you asked the question, what would you do differently? I definitely didn't listen as much as I do now. And I will attribute a lot to that to Deb. I know I joked around earlier about you being, the greatest mentor I've ever had. That is absolutely true. And you definitely taught me to listen and to really listen with 2 ears, right? We've got 2 ears and one mouth. But that aspect of listening allows the organization to advance and leaders to ensure that long tenured board members at least are part of the shaping of a new future. You might be on, you're mute, Cleve.
I knew someone's going to say that. I got to say it to you earlier. It had to happen, right? Gordon, I'm going to shift it over to you. And just as a reminder, Gordon runs one of California's largest land trusts. And so a little bit, perhaps a different perspective than Dieter who's been working in partnership lately with the feds. So Dieter, jump in. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Gordon.
thanks. No, it's okay. Yeah, so I'll just share, some similar thoughts related to Dieter's and also some differences given the difference between our organizations, as Cleve just highlighted. So again, I'm fairly new to my role. And in stepping in and attempting to fill the big shoes of my predecessor, who had been at Post for 31 years and had been our president for 15 years, what I was really focused on as a new CEO, albeit one who had been at the organization for a long time, was really maintaining momentum and continuing our kind of strong track record of success. And many years ago, we implemented at Post term limits for board members such that our board members can serve up to 12 years, so 4 3-year terms. And I think we're finding among peers that that's actually quite a long time. And we're also aware of some organizations that have no term limits whatsoever, which I think can make it challenging to bring in new, fresh ideas and perspectives, especially in a field like conservation, which Post operates in, which is really dynamic and which has really evolved and shifted a lot in recent years. Admittedly, we operate in Silicon Valley, so I think people are used to innovation, they're used to disruption, they're used to change. But I think that, folks who are in conservation and other nonprofit spaces are aware that the world around us is changing a lot. And so we need to evolve as organizations. And I would 100% echo what Dieter shared earlier as far as in terms of what's working well. It's a lot about, for us as an organization, the evolution has been shifting from being an organization that's just focused on saving this many, raising this many dollars to save this many acres, to an organization that's increasingly thinking about how are we connecting all these lands through trails, through wildlife crossings? How are we thinking about equity in the context of our work? How are we thinking about wildfire resilience? One of the points you made earlier, Dieter. So I think in helping to navigate the organization through this evolution and in bringing longer term board members along who are much more focused on Post being singularly focused on sort of bucks and acres, I think what we've tried to focus on is sharing stories about donors who are moved by the non-traditional, non-transactional elements of our work to help us truly grow our donor base and ultimately the resonance of our work among a large, diverse, and growing population in and around the Bay Area. And so when we've been able to amplify those stories and demonstrate wins and grow our community in doing so, it's helped our board see the necessity of evolving in these ways and taking on new streams of work and bringing on new skill sets to be a resilient, durable organization that's trying to protect and restore and maintain resilient, durable landscapes across the region. So I can share more in some of the other questions, but those are some initial thoughts I wanted to bring in at this point.
Thanks, Gordon. And what's interesting about your transition and Deb's in both of them is these were founder or founder-like transitions that went exceedingly well. And at Post, Gordon, you've had two of them in the time I've known you, from also a very iconic leader to your predecessor to you, and all those transitions went very, very smoothly, as did Deb's. And I think that has a lot to do, and that is not the case, and it has a lot to do with how the board set them up as well, and how your predecessor at Post and then Deb, how she set up the board to succeed. So these two topics are inextricably linked. But I think before you go, Deb, I just wanted to put a punctuation mark because it's a not rare. I would say 50% roughly of long-term executive director transitions go well, and 50 really do not. And there's a lot of literature on it, but Deb, you've put in place some remarkable things, and you're the panelist who orchestrated that. So as you introduce yourself, I'd love to have you think about how you set up your board for its transitions and yours.
Yeah, thank you, Cleve. Well, it went well because I had a very capable board who were passionate, who continue to be passionate about the mission, and who knew that the importance of a leadership transition. So maybe part of the question is, how do we get to be such a strong board? I'm a big fan of term limits. If you want to avoid the problem of long-term board members, you have term limits, and term limits are best practice, in my opinion, for nonprofits. There's other ways to keep people involved and engaged. In our organization, we had 3-year terms, and you could do 2 of those. So you could do up to 6 years. Then you had to be off a year. You could potentially come back if you chose. And term limits for us was a great way for people for whom it just wasn't the right match, either from their perspective or ours, to gracefully step aside. I also sense, and I'll say this as someone who also serves on boards, sometimes you just get weary, and the meetings and all that's involved, and being able to have that way to walk away. But all that to say, I think you attract good board members when you operate a board professionally, When you recognize talent, you have a very careful governance process for selecting board members. When you are affirming your board members and giving them a rich experience, they'll work hard and work on your behalf. I think where I've seen problems with transitions is when board members don't kind of stay in their lane. And I think for the executive directors out there, I think that's part of your role is training, doing good board training, board learning, so people understand the difference in the function of governing. And that's very different than managing an organization and staying in one's lane so that one keeps appropriate in the level of decisions. And I'll say one last thing, and then I'm happy to talk further about this later. But I think also as part of good governance is managing board meetings and managing board volunteerism. People volunteer because they love the organization. Board members are volunteers. Always keeping that in mind, using their time well, at meetings, not burning them out with too many meetings, especially over topics that are really management topics.
Thank you, Deb. Great intro, and so many questions going for me, but I'm going to hold it and stay on script for at least for a couple more minutes. And Gordon, I'm going to turn the first question to you, which is at Post, you're coming up with a 50-year anniversary, and you have an incredible reputation in Silicon Valley, and I'd say throughout the country, if not the nation. And I'm curious, how are you, this 50-year legacy as an organization, also in a place that tends to reward innovation and disruption? I'm curious how you're managing and how you're thinking about this, particularly given the remarkable roles that some of those folks have played over the years.
Thanks, Cleve. Yeah, I'll just share briefly, given that one of the themes that has been coming up is around, CEO transitions, that my predecessor was incredibly thoughtful in timing his retirement such that I could step in a full 2 years before this 50th anniversary, which is a really significant milestone for Post as an organization. And so that really gave me the time to spend my first year in the role navigating a lot of very known and sort of necessary transitions in the executive team, because we had a whole slew of executives who were all at retirement age. So I needed to spend 2025, reconfiguring and reconstructing and doing some reorganization of the staff, and have been able to spend a lot of 2026 bringing on some new board members. And this is getting to your question, Cleve, because what I've really been focusing on is thinking about the composition of our board and the need to sort of honor Post past while also leading a bold, vision for the future. And so in terms of the current composition of our board and the way that I've been thinking about the 4 board members who we've brought on this year is trying to balance between bringing on people who are both new to the organization and also people who've been involved with the organization for quite some time in other volunteer capacities or in donor capacities. And it's really helped in much the same way that I compose the executive team based on longstanding sort of nonprofit leaders who've come up through the ranks of Post, while bringing in outside people to sort of fill out our executive team. I've thought about the board in terms of the benefits of having people who know Post from the inside out and people who kind of come in from the outside to get to know Post from the outside in. So we've been able to fill board seats over the last 3 or 4 years, both through open searches, which have brought on completely new people. We had a wonderful search with Potrero Group a few years ago that brought on 4 completely new people to Post. And then some of the recent searches that we've done since then have brought on some folks who were sort of known to Post or more known to our board. And I think it's given us a really good balance in terms of the composition of our board to help us both in terms of how we think about this 50th anniversary as something that we believe is sort of 80% looking back at the past and celebrating and honoring the past, 20% that, and 80% looking forward. And I think for us, this milestone, and for many other organizations, you can trip over sort of what is this milestone really about. And for us, it's less about raising as much money as possible from an existing stable of existing major donors, and it's much more about growing the tent, raising awareness of what we do, maintaining relevance in people's lives among the millions of people who we serve in this region. And what I've tried to do is, in the year and a half I've been in this role, and in my prior role where I was helping support board recruitment, I've tried to keep an eye to, how are we focusing on specific skill sets that we need to fill vis-a-vis audit or investment or fundraising or some of the sort of nuts and bolts needs that you kind of can't overlook in composing a board. But also, how are we bringing in different perspectives of different board members with different experience, either in the for-profit, nonprofit, or public sector, or who are different generations or who have different lived experiences. And I think it's given us a really broad perspective. And the last thing I'll share related to this 50th is that we're going to have at the very start of next year an event that will be a chance to bring together all of our current board, all of our former board, both of my predecessors, and it'll be a chance to really celebrate the past of Post. And a lot of the other things that we're thinking about next year are going to be really looking to the future of Post. But we will have that moment in time where everyone who's been with the organization for a very, very long time can come together and celebrate one another. And I think that'll be a really wonderful opportunity for folks while we're also shaping a bold and ambitious vision for the next 50 years of our work. So I think balance is maybe one of the things that I'm sort of dancing around actually saying, but that's something that I've tried to keep an eye to with regard to navigating the staff and the board through this really exciting milestone for the organization.
Great. You set up the next question perfectly, which is for you, Dieter, which is, Dieter, you've been the CEO of 2 or 3 organizations. You've consulted for many more. So you have a very national perspective on this question. But really what Gordon was speaking to is a bit the tension between the history and the future, right? You need that history, and those folks have given so much, and you need to be able to focus on the forward while honoring that incredible legacy. So I'm curious, either in your role at NFF or your other roles, like how do you balance, and how have you seen people balance that somewhat of a creative tension between those two forces?
Excellent question, Cleve, and maybe just again a little more context for the National Forest Foundation. So we have up to 30 board members. We can appoint up to 30 board members, and our board is appointed by the Secretary of Agriculture. Board members can serve 2 6-year terms, but it's interesting, as we're talking today, I was reflecting a little bit more on the title of today's webinar, and we talk about long-tenured board members, but there's also an element of former board members who are still in the ecosystem, and then longtime donors. And sometimes, in sort of what I've observed, there are folks who are perhaps former board members who still believe the organization is at a certain place that it was when they were on the board, and perhaps they haven't been fully brought into how the organization's evolved, or more importantly, how it needs to evolve. And that can lead to tension too. So I think the recipe in terms of how do you navigate history with the present and the future all comes down to, I'd say, sort of the 3 things. The first one is all about getting the context that I shared a few minutes ago, and listening and actively asking individuals who have been a part of the organization, asking them how they think the organization can grow. Whether it was when I was at National Park Foundation, whether it's here at National Forest Foundation, or whether it was when I was at the San Diego Museum of Art, it's about moving those discussions from personal preferences to organizational needs. And that's part of that active listening. Then it comes down to taking all of that information in and creating a vision for the future. Like, what do we want to get people excited about? What do we want people to feel inspired by, so that we all of us stand on the shoulders of the people that came before us? So let's never forget that. And so in doing so, in establishing a vision, we want to celebrate their legacy in helping us get to this place, and then get them excited to think about the future potential and impact that the organization they help build can have. And in doing so, you're hopefully building a community of champions. And as you talk to other trusted board members and donors who are seeing that vision, have their voices carry weight too. So it doesn't just sit on one person in the C-suite or a handful of people in the C-suite. This is about building that movement so people can see themselves as part of an optimistic and positive future. They want to be as successful as you do ultimately. And the final thing that I'll say around this, how do you celebrate the history, you know, establish the present and envision the future? Don't ever criticize any decisions of the past, right? I'm sure, and Deb, this is another conversation that you and I have had multiple times. There are so many things that when I've stepped into my various roles in my career, over the term of my career, where I've looked back and I said, why was that decision made? And I will never know because I never walked in that person's shoes. And so I can't fathom or understand what the conditions were on the ground to make that decision. But there's no point in criticizing. The point is understanding what is happening and then thinking about how to set the future up for success. So I would say that those are the three things. How do you celebrate the history and make sure that you're envisioning a brighter future? That's what I would say to that, Cleve.
Great, great answer. And I like how you're speaking to both board members on the call and staff members on this call, because we have both of them. And that's usually how these webinars line up, and it's true from what I can tell in the chat and people's various roles. So I appreciate that and appreciate the perspectives you have. Deb, I'd like to zoom in a little bit in your past organization, because you, I would say, have one of the best founder transitions I've seen. And again, topic here is board transitions, but you can't separate that from CEO transitions in my mind. If your board's not doing its job, you're not going to have a good CEO transition. I'd love to hear how you led the Conservancy for 23 years, roughly, I think, maybe longer. And you were the founder, and you set it up beautifully, partially because you were willing to let go and trust and not hang on to things and know that you had done the right thing. So I would love it if you could to help walk through a little bit of how you thought about your own transition, but through the board lens and your advice to the board.
Yeah, first of all, Dieter, that was beautifully stated. I'm glad this is being recorded, because what you just said is so powerful. And I'll kind of build off of that a little bit to say that, I was so lucky I had my passion job. How many of us, have a dream job, and I hope all of you that are listening feel you're in your dream jobs. And it's hard to walk away. It's hard to walk away from something that's really important to you. But I think it's important to always remind yourself that it's never about one person, is it? It's never this was never my organization. Matter of fact, I would tell staff, I would never call them my staff. They were the organization staff. And I would counsel if I started hearing managers in my organization saying, well, my staff, my people. No, they're not yours. They belong to the mission of the organization. And who's at the top of that mission is the board of directors. So constantly having the board feel empowered to make decisions, empowered to look for the kind of leader they needed. I shared that I was leaving almost a year ahead of time. And I said right up front, they needed to look for a leader very different from me. I was a founder. I have a different skill set than what they need at this point. So they're not replacing me. They shouldn't worry about, my ego or anything in this. It's really about finding the next best leader for the organization. And I think that's true for good board members too. I think when you have people who understand their role in governance, they understand that they have these 3 or 6 or 12 years to give the best they can. And then it's good for organizations to have new people come in and give opinions and lead in different directions. And just as you said, Cleve, about you never, or Dieter, you said it, you never criticize the past. you also never criticize the future. You want the future to be set up for success. So I started using language with staff and board as soon as I announced that, well, this will be something for your next leader. Give them the freedom to make these decisions. They're going to make great decisions about this. Language matters, and constantly moving it towards the positive. And then I think, Cleve, the other thing I would say is I had to really check myself, especially in the last 3 to 6 months of my presence, as soon as the search was really nearing its end, to start to realize my opinion didn't matter as much anymore, and to be really I'm not all that important. I'm not all that important. It's about we and the team, and to allow team members to make even more decisions. I had wonderful staff who could step up the plate, turn things over to them, have them be ready to plan for the transition to the new CEO, how they will help that person be successful. Again, language matters, and that's what we talked about and what we did to try to make this feel like a really positive transition, because it's healthy for an organization to have change. And that's what I hope board members also understand, is change can be good. There's ways to use people from the past. And Dieter, you did a nice job of speaking to that, and honor and respect what the past has. But there's also ways to put value on the future and people that can lead into the future.
Thanks, Deb. And I'm going to have one more big question for each of the panelists, but I'd welcome everyone listening to put in questions into the chat, and then we'll address those or ask you to take yourself off of mute if you're comfortable being recorded. So great time to ask questions, because this is a terrific panel, as I know you can tell. My thought here, or my question is, I have something on my board here that I put up a month or so ago. It's really on my whiteboard right now, and it says, founder transitions are psychological processes disguised as organizational processes. And once I heard that, I still don't even know who said it, it's made it into my book on boards that's coming out, but it changed everything for me. And to recognize that long-tenured board members are dealing with psychological processes of grieving. One of my very first consulting gigs was at Pearl Harbor, was with the it's called Pacific Historic Parks, great organization. But all the board members there, they had no term limits, and they had some challenges as a result, but they were all directly tied, family connections to the bombing at Pearl Harbor, right? And so they were very, in a very real way, grieving what happened there still, and it was hard for them to move on and evolve because they didn't have term limits. But I didn't at the time know this quote, because I do actually think it's helpful when working with founding board members, or long-tenured board members, or long-tenured or founding executive staff. So I would just kind of love to go around the Zoom room and just hear you. You can either agree with that or disagree with it, but just hear, like, given that and given what we talked about, what advice would you have for a CEO or for board chair or board members navigating long-term tenures of board members, and maybe instituting board term limits or something else? And you could start, whoever feels moved to speak. Dieter, you look like you're ready to go, so I'm not calling you.
Voluntold. There you go.
Exactly.
Yeah, Cleve, great question. And it's interesting, because I think there's probably an inherent level of fear that a lot of people carry with them when they sort of, oh my gosh, they dread this conversation. It's coming. I have to have this conversation. How's it going to go? And how do I game it out? And I learned from an executive coach a few years ago, spent some time sort of going through my own psychology and what drives me forward, and quickly learned that, probably inherent to my father's continued beating into me, that, you have to be perfect, you have to, get everything right. That for me, when I was approaching conversations earlier in my life, it was very much about, how can I be the perfect leader? How can I be the perfect husband, father? And I think we all know that perfection is just, It's not a reality. And through a series of various efforts and exercises, we leaned into what do I ultimately want my primal question to be that drives me and motivates me? And it comes down to how can I appreciate and enjoy the people in my life even more? And it's a simple shift just in words, but psychologically speaking, it's changed my perspective on when I approach a conversation, a hard conversation, it comes down to, again, what is driving this person's desire to associate with the organization and find that common ground and start there and engage the individual in a way that allows everyone to feel like, yes, this is what's best for the organization. Goes back to Deb's point about, me over we. I believe in we over me, without a doubt. And so if you can have a hard conversation and do it in a way where it's couched under the premise of the goal here is to let the organization flourish, don't approach the conversation with dread, but see it as an opportunity to grow and deliver greater impact and have the person you're speaking with be a part of that journey. That's what I would say.
Yeah.
Cleveland, I appreciate.
You went on mute, Deb. I don't know if you
Keep hitting it the wrong way. I apologize. I appreciate your putting this in the context of grief because I think for a lot of long-term, whether it's employees or volunteers, which again, board members are volunteers, leaving something that they love, there is no doubt that there's grief. There's no doubt that that's a grieving process and recognizing that. And I think for where I've seen some long-term board members and some boards I've served on that don't have term limits, that have board members been around a long, long time, this is so much a part of their life. Sometimes they're doing this volunteer work in honor or in memory of a loved one. They may have such a tie to that in a national park, to the land, that they're serving for emotional reasons, and recognizing it is I think the first step to helping a transition go more smoothly. And sometimes that means finding another role that's appropriate. Some boards I've seen them do like honorary boards or senior boards, whatever. I'm not a big fan of that. I think that can be dangerous if people don't understand they're still not the board anymore. But I think there are significant ways to use long-term volunteers that would really love to serve in other ways. And if you're an executive director, maybe it's as a personal advisor to you at times and do, walk and talks with them, twice a year and learn from them. Maybe there's a committee that they can serve on of an aspect that they really care about so that you're easing that grief of that transition and they can remain connected to the organization. Now, I will say I feel differently about that from a staff perspective. I think if you're the leaving executive, it's really important to get out of the way and figure out how to do your own grieving about the loss of that job that meant so much to you in a healthy way. Either replace it with something else or just do that process apart from the job. It's not fair to the rest of the organization. But I think for volunteers who really love the organization, find another way to use those skills so that they can still have some connection with the organization.
I love that. I agree. And I feel like the founder board members or long-tenured board members or CEOs that have other interests and other connections, they're willing to and able to let go for the health of the organization. And those where they're wrapped up in their identity is challenging. And I think that's part of what I've known about you is you have such a rich life outside of your identity as a CEO and founder. And that I think will help you.
I heard Deb is going to play the viola for us in 10 minutes from now.
Not on Zoom.
I can't wait.
That sounds great. I'm thinking we should have a little music accompaniment here. I'm seeing some questions come in. Keep them coming. We'll get to it. Gordon, love to hear your take on this this question.
Yeah,
Feel free
I
to
mean,
disagree. You don't have to. You guys you're all just agreeing with each other, but it's fine to disagree.
Well, when you posed the question, Cleve, I found myself jotting down some of the same things that Deb actually just said, as far as, Post trying to establish a lot of mechanisms and ways that people can remain involved, either in more sort of formal advisory roles or in sort of lighter weight ambassador roles, leading hikes and outings for the public, getting their friends out on, hikes and outings that we're doing. So, I think we do try to find a lot of ways to remain close with former board members, even if they're not occupying, an actual board seat. I'll also just share and reflect on, the notion of grieving. I mean, as far as sort of CEOs, I'm the fourth president of a 49-year-old organization. So there's been some very, very long tenured people who have preceded me, and there have been grieving periods associated with their departures and the transition to the next leader. But fortunately, in three of those cases, that next leader was someone who had been at the organization for a long time, who was known to the long-standing board members and was known to longtime donors. But I also just, as someone who came up into my role through the major gifts fundraising world, I'm pretty keyed into the fact that of the thousands of people who support our work every year, they're coming at this work from very, very different places, and they're moved and inspired by different aspects of what we do. And so Dieter was speaking earlier about sort of identifying and drawing someone out as far as what was it that first sparked you about Post? How did you get involved with our organization all these years ago? And, what is it about the work that we're doing now that you're most inspired by, or that maybe you have questions about, and use it as an opportunity to listen and learn from them and to give them a chance to reflect on their experience, which for many has been one of the most powerful things that they've ever done. I mean, amidst professional and personal careers that span a lot of different things. I'm just always struck by how meaningful a lot of our longstanding board members speak about their experience serving on our board. And so I really want to sort of honor what it is that most inspires them about our work. And while also sort of being mindful of and sort of trying to, in certain ways, shift the conversation to be able to bring up things that are acknowledging, the evolving needs of the organization, the need for the long-term financial resilience of the organization and opportunities to engage and recruit new donors and new funders, opportunities that in a shifting landscape around us are surfacing new gaps in areas where other organizations aren't suited to fill, but that will amplify and expand and extend our mission and our ability to have impact. So I think I would also just agree with one of the points Deb made. I mean, as someone who's been navigating a lot of change in the first year and a half in my role, I mean, change is good and innovation is good. And I think organizations that don't change and evolve, run the risk of just struggling to maintain relevance and sort of resiliency. And so I would just say that, I think it is very much possible to sort of honor the past and the remarkable accomplishments and contributions of longstanding founding board members and longstanding board members and find other ways for them to continue to be involved, while also exciting them and inspiring them with opportunities to grow and evolve the organization in the future, and demonstrating the degree to which the evolution of those efforts can bring in a whole new cohorts of supporters. And one of the things my predecessor's predecessor, who's over 80, who I've known for 20 years, who I still keep in touch with, when I've spoken with her recently, she's much less focused on, well, what did I accomplish in my 24 years of running the organization? And what she really cares about is mostly just that the organization's still doing really well and it's still doing really meaningful work. And she's not driving that work, but she's a resident of our area, so she's benefiting from it. And so to your earlier point, Deb, it's really less about the person and more about the organization. And we're all trying to lead in various ways organizations that we want to be around for the long haul. And so I think navigating these transitions can be challenging, but I think there are ways that people can see themselves in our past and also are present in our future. And look forward to responding to questions that folks have along those lines. So
good. We're getting some good ones. And one of the things I would note, having watched your organization for 30 years, Gordon, is one of the hallmarks I see in my role doing founder transitions and long-term executive transitions is that typically a really great founder has or long tenured CEO has really strong bench strength below them, or around them. And so while their people might not get the job, they often are capable and could be appropriate for the job. And usually when the transition isn't being managed well, there's just the board looks around the staff and no one is ready to take on that role, and so then they hand it to a board member, and then all sorts of dysfunction takes place. So I just, it is really remarkable how your organization has now, and the leader you spoke was legend. I mean, was groundbreaking, truly a legend in the field, and there's a lot of angst about her departure, and yet your organization has continued to just be on an upward trajectory through those transitions. There's some great questions coming in the chat, and the first one I'm going to paraphrase a little bit because it's a little bit long, but I think the question is really, well, and maybe I'll direct it a little bit at you, Dieter, but anyone can answer it. But this idea that you don't want to harp on the past, but we want to learn from the past, right? And I'm curious how, or it doesn't have to be you, Dieter. You're easy to pick on because you're my eyesight, my line of sight there. But how do you navigate that? Because you don't want to sweep mistakes under the rug. You want to learn from them, but you don't want to sweep the people under the rug because that never really works out very well.
Yeah, hey Gordon, I think we said that Deb would take the hard questions, right?
Oh yeah.
Isn't that what we agreed on, Gordon?
Yeah, exactly. We all agreed to that.
This is a bit of a hard one for me to answer because I'm somebody who I don't sure I've got thoughts on my mind when I think back, like who the hell made that decision, or why is that decision made? But it's not in the framework of my gosh, that person is incompetent, or like to me, again, it's all in the framework of we want to learn from decisions, and this I guess gets a little bit, Gordon, you were speaking about innovation. Innovation isn't just technology, right? Innovation is how we challenge prior assumptions of how we're doing things, in my perspective. And the more we can learn from history, the more we can learn from prior decisions, and be honest about speaking to the board about, all right, we went down this path and it seems like it didn't go well the first time, or it didn't manifest in the way we had hoped for. Help me understand why you think that is. Help me understand why the original decision was made. And again, that's the learning process that, who knows, maybe that strategic direction was the exact right thing, but it was executed by somebody on the team that didn't have the skill set or the motivation, or they left in between. Like, it's a complicated question to dissect, other than, yes, I agree, we should not sweep things, poor decisions under the rug, but we should learn from them and then see if they're appropriate to make going forward. Maybe the timing wasn't right. So I don't know if I'm answering that question properly, but I see, Deb, you came off of mute, so please.
Well, I would just add to that I agree with your answer, Dieter, but I would add to that, again, setting a tone and a framework that in building an organization, you're going to take risks and you're going to make mistakes, right? And if you're not taking risks and you're not making mistakes, you're probably not a very effective leader. And so if you're looking at the past and looking at problems or mistakes from that perspective, it's not like somebody was trying to screw the organization or be a bad leader, but how do we learn from mistakes? But in that framework, I think that is a more positive and helpful framework, and makes it a little bit easier in terms of understanding why decisions were made.
And one other thing I would add, and is just that, well, I'll speak for myself. oftentimes at Post, we focus a lot on just celebrating all the good things that we have done. And we don't oftentimes lift up experiments that were bold and ambitious, but that didn't work out. And I think it sounds odd to say, but one of the things I'm trying to do is sort of lift up some of those things that didn't work out so that people know that we should continue to have an appetite to be experimental and to take some risk and to try to be bold. And so, yes, we want to learn from those things. And we also want to ensure that staff and the board and leadership continue to have an appetite for being innovative and being bold and maybe taking some risks sometimes, and knowing that those things won't always work out. And in some ways, it's almost worth sort of celebrating the things that didn't work out so that people don't just expect that everything has to work out all the time, because that can lead to a mentality that isn't conducive to sort of innovation and challenging the past and thinking boldly and ambitiously about the future.
And if I can just add one more thing here,
Please.
I keep right now it feels like the world is constantly in flux, right? We wake up to the news cycle and some things come up that as leaders we now either have to respond to or have to incorporate into our business model. And I was speaking with my team the other day and asking folks around the room, like, how many of you have read Who Moved My Cheese? I don't know how many people on this call remember that, but it's I think a fascinating book that is so apropos and timely again on so many levels. But it gets to this point around, okay, the cheese moved and the two mice that end up scurrying out into the maze, and we don't know what happened to them. They made a decision. Who knows if it was a good or bad decision, but to Deb's point, they took a risk. And we hope that the mice are doing well and thriving somewhere. But Hem and Haw, who the story really is about, they didn't take that risk. And I think if you dissect that story, again, we're not criticizing Hem and Haw, we're just saying there was a different approach here that probably could have served Hem and Haw better. That's what I take away from that story. And that's why I think understanding the history and the decisions made in the past help us move towards a brighter future.
I love it. Great. Sparked a great question. And I think to me, it gets back to the core reason why we need vibrant boards. And it's really hard to have a vibrant board if you don't have term limits and have new energy coming in and new perspective. It's also why I've become a big fan of open board search, because you get very different people coming to the table without tokenizing them, without marginalizing them, and you get real, genuine perspectives. And it is important when you bring young people or people that have not historically had opportunities to be on boards, how differently they help the organization evolve. And one of the classic examples in the Bay Area is one in the AIDS community. My generation of people, AIDS was in the U.S. was a fatal disease, and I had a housemate who was dying of AIDS. Like, I can't unsee that, right? Like, that is going to influence it. If I had stayed on a AIDS serving organization for the last 30 years, it's very different than somebody who, in the U.S., it's less likely to be a fatal disease. There are many other challenges, but I actually have a limited perspective because of my history. Doesn't mean my perspective is wrong. It's just not necessarily current to some of the challenges that the HIV positive community has. I'm just taking a little bit of conservation, but my perspective isn't wrong. I just can't unsee that person I lived with, and that for my generation of people, it was a fatal disease for most of them, right? And it's very different. My kids' generation, they have friends who are HIV positive and are healthy and living great lives, and they have other challenges, right? So that's a very tangible thing that we see here in the Bay Area around board evolution, and it's been complicated to AIDS serving organizations for a very real issue here. I'm going to shift it, but I think it just points to a core takeaway that I've heard us talking about, is the vibrancy of boards. And you don't want to lose that history, but you want it to be vibrant and current, right? I'm going to get to Jen's question. Jen, not to be on the spot, but I know you represent an organization that serves other organizations. I know it's not your organization, but you see this across the sector. Feel free to come off mute if you want to, Jen. Do you want to say your question? I don't want to totally put you on the spot. You'll be recorded, so just so you know.
No, that's fine. And thank you. Yeah, I mean, I work with a lot of directors, especially newer directors that could come into a long-term organization. And for whatever reason, and it's often just, it's inappropriate. They're challenged at every step by a board member. They could be one of the founding board members or a long-term board member, and they're challenged, all their decisions, their authority, everything. And it's done in a way that other board members, for whatever reason, aren't empowered to step up or aren't helping. And just looking, what advice would you give that director who's trying to manage that difficult board member?
Interesting. This is not unlike your role with Friends Alliance, Deb, where you see a lot of different organizations at different life lifespans. So I'm going to point at you, since I know you've done a lot of work with organizations.
Yeah, and thanks, Jen, for the question. I'm was a longtime member of ANCA and a big fan of your work. That is not an uncommon problem, and I especially see it with younger, newer executive directors. Frankly, of my generation, if we were female, we had the double whammy on top of it sometimes, especially with older men. I'm not offending anybody, but that was a reality for me early in my career too. Um, I think it's most helpful to have an honest sit down with a board member that's challenging, and be very open and honest about when you undercut me, this happens. And when I had faced a similar situation early in my career, I often found that kind of open conversation kind of brought them into what my world was like of how am I to lead if you're constantly questioning me. And I tried to turn that so that they would be my ally as opposed to my critic, and to do it again in a positive way. I appreciate you have a lot of thoughts and ideas. You're a successful business person. I know you're critical of some of the things I do. Um, but it's really hard for me to be a leader if I am constantly being undermined. It hurts my confidence. It makes other people question my leadership. I have found when that kind of open and honest conversation happens, oftentimes it creates change. So that's my number one piece of advice on that is just to don't let it fester. Bring it out into the open in a very kind and caring way, and try to deal with it head on. Otherwise, I think that undermining and that lack of confidence in your leadership will just continue to grow if it's not put in its right place early on. It's a tough one. I feel for execs that have to deal with that.
Hey, Deb, just to add on to the question, what do you see the role of the board chair being in a
Oh,
situation like this?
yeah, good question. Well, you probably know the answer on that, Peter. I bet. I mean, that is your other thing is your board chair should be your ally. I guess I was thinking more about sometimes it's the board chair that does that, frankly, is the one that is behind you. But yeah, I think a board chair or an executive committee. I mean, I've had issues as recent as a few years ago where I've had to go to the board chair and say this board member is not again staying in their lane. They're getting into space they shouldn't be in. And then we talk about whether I should address it or the board chair should address it. I think a good board chair wants to step up and help make sure that board members aren't undercutting their executive director. And sometimes it's the people, and I don't know, Cleve, you might have a thought about this, but sometimes it's those who served on the search committee who will be the best defenders of you. We
Yeah.
selected this person, we want them to succeed. So could a member of that search committee also step in and be an ally?
So sorry, do you want to put in a question or you want me to articulate? Feel free to get off mute if you feel. You want me to do it? Okay. I don't want to put you on the spot. Great. So this is a really good one, good question around, smaller organizations, because we have a range on this panel and in the audience. But this kind of challenge of the ED who needs to stay a lot of small organizations often is where the term limit issue comes up. I mean, all three of you run larger, although it wasn't when you started, Deb, but you've run very large and complex organizations. You built it that way, but over time. But we see this a lot more with small organizations where the founders are, have been there for a long, founding board members have been there a long time, and then they get to that place where they hire an ED, and everyone's kind of confused about roles. And the ED has to stabilize. The question is really, has to stabilize organization while leading all this governance change, which can also be threatening to your job sometimes. So, the question is, what helps an ED and board chair build this partnership when the organization is has limited capacity because it's a small organization, probably trying to do a lot, and a lot of people rely on it. So you can see the rest of the question if you want to pull in some of the threads. Gordon, you're off mute, so looks like you're ready.
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, so I'm again fairly new to my role and stepped in as the leader of the organization amidst a time of sort of generational change among the leadership team and to a degree among the board too. And I'm also on the board of a much smaller organization that's maybe more analogous to what your question's getting at, Cesar. So, that's also going through its own kind of growing pains associated with some growth and a sort of founder to new executive director transition. And I think, I think having strong allyship with the board, I was similar to the point you made, Deb, gonna make the exact point about, finding someone who was on the search committee who sort of put themselves on the line to make the decision to hire you, who has a vested interest in, you being successful, and allying yourself with that person, whether it's the board chair or others, because I think there's so many organizations that, are making that evolutionary shift from a small organization where maybe the board was really involved in kind of day-to-day management and day-to-day operations, and now they're hiring maybe their first ever or a new executive director to kind of step in and take on more of that. And I guess I'll just first acknowledge that those transitions can, and maybe more often are challenging and can take some time to get through. But I think finding allyship with key members of the board, and sort of setting expectations for, the time that you need to sort of develop, to get familiar with the organization, if you're coming in from the outside, to develop your own vision for the organization, and sort of what ideas you have vis-a-vis culture. I know that a lot of the conversation today has been focused, or at least I've perceived that it's been focused on external impact. But one of the other things that I run up against a little bit with longtime board members is just sort of they've been out of the workplace for a long time, and workplaces are very, very different right now. And so this is getting at more sort of internal staff culture, employee engagement related questions. But that's a really dynamic field too. And there's some challenges that I think we're all experiencing with that as either, nonprofit leaders or as board members. So I think that's just another thing to seek allyship and support from the board on, to the extent that that's part of the transition that you're also navigating vis-a-vis culture or governance. So I don't know if this is really getting at your question, but I just wanted to share a few thoughts, and happy to see if Deb or Dieter have other things to add, or you do, Cleve.
Dieter, Deb?
Yeah, maybe one of the things that, just to add on to Gordon, what you shared, so I've worked at both large and smaller organizations, and the thing that I've observed most at the smaller organizations I was at was the need to build capacity, internal capacity, right? And those dollars are some of the hardest dollars to come by. And the challenge you have is at the beginning, like, how do you do everything? And it's where you're probably at a point where your board is a working board more than a governing or strategic board. And a successful ED will hopefully work with their board chair to begin to outline what are the capacity needs for the organization to grow and evolve. Not, we talk a lot about the impact, driving philanthropy or other revenue sources to drive impact, but impact sometimes is a function of how do we build our own internal capacity. And that's where I would start, being an ED at a smaller nonprofit, working with the board chair to understand what are the capacity needs internally that allow the staff to grow to a level where it's self-sufficient thus moving the working board into a new level of thinking. And hopefully, by doing so, you're firing on all cylinders and allowing philanthropy to equally grow in the process. And I know it's easier said than done, but I would say without that vision or plan or attempt to grow internal capacity, you're just going to be stuck in the same cycle.
Mm. I love that. And I was going to thought of something that just left me, so I'm going to move on to the next question. But yeah, it's really good comment in here by Steve, which I think I just want to draw your attention to, which I don't think is a question as much as a comment. But Sam has a question. Feel free to go off mute if you prefer. I'll paraphrase it, which is, kind of how do you, for smaller organizations, how do you, or this is actually not 60 years old, 60-year-old organization that doesn't have these structures. So how do you establish these, and kind of how do you get, when the organization doesn't have all these formal structures in place, how have you gone about establishing it? I think is the key. Correct me if I didn't get that right. Someone else before you. I think you got it.
I'll give this a try. And my first executive director job was a very small organization. I had, first of all, just me, and then I added one and then two staff. I do think as you think about leading a small organization, you are trying to do everything, right? But I think one of the things you have to keep thinking about is how are you building the organization, and how are you putting some of those structures in place? You don't have to do it all at once, but to develop some operating principles, to develop some governance rules and regulations. There's a ton of resources out there, lots of organizations that specialize in nonprofit, support that can help you with that, or consultants that can help you with that. I think it's a framework, a mental framework in a way that not only are you creating an organization to accomplish your mission, but you're creating an organization that will sustain itself. So part of your job is to do that work, and use the expertise out there and around you. Bring in somebody to help if you need to.
That's a good segue, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of resources, and then give you a couple moments to each have your parting comment. If people forget, so I'll just kind of cue you up for it. If people forget everything that was discussed in this webinar, what do you want them to remember in a minute or less? So just think about that. I'm going to say a couple things. One is in terms of resources that you just mentioned, Deb, that made me think about, are a lot of your local universities or policy schools or business schools have great resources. And my favorite locally are Berkeley and Davis, because where I live and because where I teach. But Berkeley has a wonderful center which is devoted to supporting nonprofit leaders. It's called the Center for Social Sector Leadership. And they have a very well-developed board fellows program where they'll place a policy or business school student and work with you for 6 to 9 months. And they often come with a lot of faculty support, and it's free of charge. And it's a great program. You need to give them some of your time and effort, but they will help you with some of the board assessment and putting these structures in place. So I would highly recommend them. They also have another program that I've used twice when I was an executive director, which is a capacity building program. You have to pay for that one, but it's remarkable, and it's headed up by McKinsey's former head of the nonprofit practice. So really great resource there, and many organizations and communities, community colleges have programs that are community facing. So I would encourage that. We also have an archive of these webinars that have some great tips and strategies. We're also, Stephanie, my colleague, who's also on the call, and I are writing a book. It's going to come out early next year on board. So we'll have some thoughts, and we're even doing, this is just coming out in this just starting to announce it, we're going to be doing a retreat in the mountains, not far from where I am, for board members and staff members, where there's essentially no formal agenda, time to talk through and problem solve and learn from one another. 4 days in a beautiful location, which you'll be starting to hear more about if you're on our mailing lists. The other thing I'll say before I turn it over to the three of you is a reminder, hopefully you can see it, that our next webinar is on August 19th at the same time, and it's focusing on the number 2 position in nonprofits.
And Cleve, this is if you can refresh the slide, it actually has a different title. It's more about exploring the role and not hiring it. So
okay, why don't you give the plug, because I actually downloaded it. So why don't you just give the plug? Thanks,
okay,
Steph.
it's of course, yeah. It's called Leading Without Being in Charge inside the number 2 role. So we'll have a panel of COOs, deputy directors, talking about how to set up your organization to have the leadership support that it needs for the size and kind of the development stage that it's at.
Fabulous, thank you. And that will be about the same time on August 19th. Also same time, exactly. And we have QR codes if you're not on our newsletter or LinkedIn. We publish a lot of resources on boards. I've been on a tear lately about founder transitions. So some of my posts have been on that there, which you'll find there, or on mine on LinkedIn, because I've just been doing a lot of founder work lately. And a reminder that this webinar is recorded, and we have posted on YouTube. We'll also send it out to everybody who is registered. So feel free to forward that around, because we have a real commitment as a company to sharing resources to make the nonprofit sector stronger. So with all that saying, we've got about 2 or 3 minutes till we need to close. So I'm going to just pass it around to each of you to give us some parting comments. And yeah, who wants to lead us off?
Go ahead, Deb.
Yeah, you're on it. All right. Never shy.
Never shy, no. You learn a lot from your peers. Being an executive director can be a lonely job. Look for those peer support groups, whether that's Friends Alliance, ANCA, there's others around the country, depending on the theme that you're working with, maybe others locally for you, but lean on each other. I learned a lot from people that went before me, and I'll be eternally grateful for that.
Love that. And you're such a great mentor to so many of us in the field, Deb. So thank you for that. Gordon.
I've been reflecting on your quote earlier, Cleve, about what we're really talking about here is psychological processes, not organizational processes. And so I think just sort of honoring and acknowledging the fact that, there can be a lot of feelings and emotions wrapped up in a lot of these conversations and things that we're trying to navigate as leaders. And so I think just giving yourself time and grace and navigating that, knowing that a lot of those tough conversations really may not go very well and that that's okay. But just, seeking allyship from peers, seeking allyship from other board members. And if you're a nonprofit CEO, knowing that the board hired you because they believe in you and that you should just be you and you should pursue your vision and be authentic and be bold. And just kind of trust your gut and know that there'll be a lot of difficult, challenging things that come up along the way with board and staff and otherwise, but just, maintaining your focus on moving the organization forward. And I think that goes for a board member who's struggling to engage with a longstanding board member too. So hopefully it's a relevant set of parting words for everyone.
Great.
Okay, Dieter, bring us home.
If I can build off of what Deb and Gordon just said now, and one of our core values at the National Forest Foundation is we serve future generations. And Deb, you sort of articulated the notion of listening to who came before. Let me build on that and say, be the change so that people in the future are standing on your shoulders. And as I think about the board, it's all about proper board recruitment, board governance training. And if you can leave that legacy behind for your successor, it sets the organization up for even greater success. So that's how I'll close it out, Cleve.
Well done. I just want to thank you. The three of you are incredibly busy people, and it means the world. You can tell there's a really engaged group of people here, and these have a long tail. Like we hear back from people a year or two, 3 years later, that something they learned from the webinar. So thank you for supporting other people in the field. Thank you for giving up your most precious commodity, which is your time. And it means so much to us. And I know that, as you so aptly said, all three of you in different ways, you've benefited from other leaders, and thank you for giving back to the sector. And I think that's, I believe that our nonprofit sector is the most important democratic and institution in our country, and it's a patriotic duty as well as a moral duty to strengthen it. So I just want to thank you for being a part of that, and really hope you have a great afternoon or evening, depending upon your time zone. A reminder that this recording will be, we'll send it out to everyone who's registered. Feel free to forward it. We'll also put it on YouTube. And again, thank you for this and appreciate all that. With that, I think we will call it a wrap and turn off the recording. And thank you all for joining us. Yeah, Deb, Dieter, Gordon, thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for sharing your wisdom.